The Pack Assembly Hall had never been arranged this way before, not in any living Alpha's memory. The great stones were in their places, the flat oath rocks where Pack representatives laid their hands to vote, and the room was full. And for the first time in the history of Velmora, the person standing at the center of it was an Omega. She did not wear a Luna's dress. She did not stand behind the Alpha King. She did not carry the royal seal or the council's endorsement or any of the formal trappings that a woman in her position was supposed to require before anyone would agree to look at her. What she carried was a mark on her wrist that had once been a death sentence. What she carried was a record of a mistake that had cost lives, publicly acknowledged, unforgiven by some, because the people she had failed had the right to still be angry. What she carried was a table, not a physical one, but a system, a method, a structure that had been built from the wreckage of the worst night of her life, and the evidence it had produced was spread across the room in documents that Riven had verified, testimony that Senna had analyzed, and a falsified letter that Leora had identified. At the far end of the hall, High Counselor Varric Thorn stood with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that rooms like this one did not exist. He had miscalculated. One of the older Alphas said, "She is still an Omega." Leora stepped forward. Her eyes were the kind of tired that does not come from lack of sleep, she said. "Then remember this. An Omega saw the war your council refused to see." Elias stood at the edge of the hall, not beside Nyra, not speaking for her, watching. The Pack representatives placed their hands on the oath stones. They did not look at him, they looked at her. 1 year earlier, Nyra had been 3 hours from an execution she had not deserved. The square at Ashven was designed for Pack ceremonies, the seasonal oaths, the name-givings, the arrival of new elders. On the morning Nyra was brought to it, the crowd filled every stone step and balcony and alley entrance, and the specific quality of their attention was the attention of people who had been afraid for a long time and had found something to aim that fear at. She was 20 years old. She had been 20 for 9 days. The Ashmoon Mark had been visible on her wrist since birth, a silver-threaded spiral that the elders said was a sign of ancient corruption, a conduit for disasters that traveled toward anyone unlucky enough to stand near it. She had been told this so many times, in so many tones, that she had spent considerable energy in her childhood trying to determine whether she believed it. The evidence against her was not nothing. A child had sickened in the week after she moved to a new sleeping quarter. A stable had burned the day after she walked past it. A Pack elder had died in his sleep on the anniversary of her birth. None of these things had any causal relationship to her. But causation was not what fear required. Fear required proximity and pattern, and she had provided both by existing. Every bad thing that had happened in Ashven Pack since she was born had been added to the account. A child's fever, a stable fire, a poor harvest, a flood that took a storage building, an elder who died in his sleep. None of these were connected to Nyra in any way that evidence would recognize. But evidence was not what the Ashmoon Decree required. Varric Thorn stood at the council platform and read the law in a voice that had the quality of something being finalized. She would be executed before the 21st moon. Nyra was not permitted to speak in her defense. The law was explicit on that point. An Omega bearing the Ashmoon Mark had no standing to testify. Leora was in the crowd. Nyra could see her from the platform, her face, the specific kind of still that people make when they are holding something in with everything they have. The execution platform was 12 steps away. Elias arrived before she took the first. He did not come with ceremony. He came with a question. He stepped into the square and asked, "What crime has she committed?" Varric said, "She bore the Ashmoon Mark." Elias said, "A mark is not a confession." He suspended the order. Varric said if Elias intended to protect this woman, the law required a reason. Elias said, "I will not make her sacred to keep her alive. I will make the law admit she is human." It was the right thing to say. It was also not enough, because saying the right thing is not the same as building the conditions for it to last. Nyra did not know this yet. She was still standing on the platform, wrists unbound, watching the crowd decide whether to be relieved or furious, and thinking that she had been saved. She had not yet understood what she had been saved into. The room they gave her in the capital was small and faced north, which meant it caught the cold morning light, but not the warm afternoon kind. She did not care about that. She cared about the books. No one had let her read a full book before. She had been permitted the children's primers that circulated through Ashfin's lower quarter, but the Pack archive had been closed to her. The council's records had been closed to her. The healer's training texts had been closed to her. Now she had access to all of it. She read as though she was trying to fill something in before it could be taken away. The historical records on Ashmoon Mark were extensive and almost entirely wrong. Every account treated the mark as supernatural contamination, a spiritual disease that attracted disaster, the way standing water attracted mosquitoes. None of the accounts had considered the possibility that the mark worked in the other direction, that it did not attract danger, that it perceived it. She did not know this yet from the records. She knew it from what she had been experiencing since she was old enough to notice. The way she had always felt, a half second before something went wrong, that the air in the room had changed quality. The feeling of a door that was about to open before anyone touched the handle. The difference in light before a storm that every farmer knew but could not name. She had assumed this was fear. She was beginning to understand it might be something more structured than that. Some members of the noble circle made their displeasure known in the ways that noble circles do the deliberate exclusion from gatherings. The questions asked a half degree too loud, the repeated inquiry about why the Alpha King had not simply declared the Omega his mate if she was so important. Elias answered that question once, in a council session she was not present for, and she heard about it afterward from Senna. If she must belong to me before you let her live, then you never believed she was a person. She sat with that for a long time. Part of her was grateful. Part of her ached in the way that people ache when they want something to be simple and understand that it is not going to be. She had wanted him to choose her, not because she was in love with him yet, because a person who had spent 20 years being told she was a curse understood. At a cellular level, that belonging to someone with power was one of the most reliable protections available. She wanted to be safe. She wanted the choice to mean she was safe. Senna found her one evening in the archive, reading the historical accounts of Ashmoon Mark carriers. She sat across the table and said without preamble, "Your survival should not require a man's love to legitimize it." Nyra looked at the mark on her wrist. "I know," she said, "but knowing it and not wanting it are different things." Senna did not argue with that. She said, "Then let's talk about what the mark actually is." The first vision Nyra had clear enough to interpret came 3 weeks into her time at the capital. It arrived the way all of them did, not in sleep, but in the moment between sleep and waking, when the mind was neither defended nor distracted. Stonewall Square burning. Smoke that moved like it had been structured, not like natural fire. A bell tower with a crack running from the base to the third tier. Children running in the wrong direction, toward the smoke instead of away from it. A woman kneeling at a well, trying to lift a bucket that would not come. Black water under the bridge at the square's south end. And a hand. She always noticed hands in visions, because hands told you what people were doing in the moment that mattered, wearing a council ring on the fourth finger. Senna sat with her afterward and went through the vision piece by piece. She explained what she had been studying for years before the council banned her research. The mark was not a curse. It was a sensitivity, an attunement to danger, to the specific frequency of events converging toward harm. A possibility site. But Senna said it with a seriousness that Nyra would remember for the rest of her life. A vision is not an order. It is a question demanding evidence. Nyra understood this in theory. In practice, the image of children running into smoke was very difficult to hold at arm's length. She went to Elias. She told him what she had seen. She told him she could not be certain. He asked if she was sure. She said, "No, but if I wait until I am sure, what if the smoke has already reached them?" The decision to evacuate Stonewall Square was made that night. The people were taken to Old Mill Hollow, 3 miles east, on a road that messengers had reported as clear. It should have been the right decision. It should have been. But Riven had been at the road that afternoon, and Riven had told her 3 things she did not hear with sufficient attention. The road was unusually clean, as though it had been prepared. The bridge over the mill tributary had new wood mixed into the old planks, a replacement that had not been on any maintenance record. A messenger bearing urgent news of movement in the hills had arrived at a timing that was, by his estimate, too convenient. Nyra had heard all 3 warnings. She had written them down. She had looked at them while the image of children running towards smoke played behind her eyes with the specific persistence of things that felt like prophecy. Riven had said the road was too clean, the vision said. Children, smoke, fire, a mother who could not lift the water. She had asked herself which evidence was more reliable, the physical reading of a road by a wolfless scout from a small pack, or the image her mark had been producing with increasing clarity for 3 days. She had chosen the image. She had chosen it because it was louder. That was not the same as being more true. The fire won. The bridge at Old Mill Hollow was built for pack transport, the heavy, slow movement of supply wagons on dry summer roads. It was not built for a panicked crowd moving at night, after a messenger's report of approaching enemies. The planks that had been replaced were not sealed. They were laid to look right from above. When the weight hit the eastern section, the bridge went down in pieces, not all at once, which was worse, because the people at the back did not know to stop. Nyra was on the far bank when the sound changed. She remembered the sound very precisely. She would remember it for the rest of her life. She ran back toward the bridge, but the bridge was gone, and the water was black in the torchlight, and there were people in it, and some of them were being pulled out, and some of them were not. Leora's brother had been near the back of the crossing. He had gone back to help a child who had stumbled. He was 17 years old. Stonewall Square did not burn that night. Stonewall Square did not burn the following night either. When Nyra walked through it 3 days later, it was intact. Varric spoke in the council chamber the morning after the disaster and said, in the mild tone of a man who had been patiently expecting this, that the Ashmoon Mark had once again brought catastrophe to those who trusted it. He proposed reinstating the Ashmoon Decree. Nyra went to find Leora. Leora was sitting in the room she had shared with her brother. She did not look up when Nyra entered. She said, in a voice that had been used until it had nothing decorative left in it, "You saw a fire, but my brother drowned because everyone believed you saw enough." Nyra did not answer. There was no answer that was not also a diminishment of what had been lost. She stood in the doorway and let the words be what they were. In the weeks after Old Mill Hollow, the options available to Nyra were few, and none of them were comfortable. She could retreat. She could accept Elias's protection, move back into the palace, let the council's version of events stand as the primary narrative. Ashmoon Mark bearer acts on incomplete vision. Disaster results. The old law begins to look like wisdom. She could disappear into a form of safety that would require her to stop being anything other than the woman the Alpha King had decided not to execute. She thought about this seriously. She was standing in the square outside the palace archive when she thought about it most clearly, and she thought, I have spent my entire life being asked to disappear as the price of being allowed to exist. She was not going to do it again. She went to Varick's next council session instead. She stood before the full council and said, I was wrong at Old Mill Hollow. I had a vision that was real. I disobeyed a warning that was real. I allowed urgency to replace evidence. The people who died were not the cost of a prophecy. They were the cost of a decision I made without enough information. Someone threw something at her. She did not flinch. She had thought about what she was going to say for 3 days, and in those 3 days, she had considered every form of partial truth, every framing that would acknowledge the harm without fully claiming the decision, every way of saying sorry that preserved a pathway to not being entirely responsible. She had discarded all of them, not because they would not have worked, because she had spent her entire life watching people use partial truths to protect themselves from accountability, and she knew what the other side of that felt like. She was not going to do it. Leora was not in the room, Elias was. He did not stand up. He did not use his alpha voice to command the room into order. He sat and watched her hold what she had done, and understood something about what she was building in that moment that could not be built if he helped. If he spoke, the council would hear him. If she spoke, the council would have to decide whether to hear her. That decision, their decision, made freely in front of witnesses, was the only kind that would last. Varick proposed the reinstatement immediately after her statement, in the specific way of someone who had prepared for this and was pleased at how it was going. Nyra said, I will not tell you my mark is not dangerous. I will show you what I am going to do differently. She walked out. The corridor outside the council chamber was empty. She stood in it for a moment and breathed. She had not told the council about the detail she had discovered in the week after the disaster, the detail that made Old Mill Hollow more complicated than simply a misjudgment. Varick had been preparing the bridge before she had the vision. The displacement of the original planks had been done weeks earlier. If the evacuation had never happened, if she had never acted on the vision, the bridge would still have been sitting there waiting for the next market day crowd. She did not use this as absolution. She had been warned at the road that something was wrong. She had not listened carefully enough to stop the evacuation she had already set in motion. The fact that Varick had wanted her to fail did not change the fact that she had given him a failure to use. Both things were true. She had 3 weeks to figure out what she was going to build from both of them before Varick's next move. The risk table came out of 2 conversations and 1 very long night with Senna, Riven, and a map of Old Mill Hollow that Riven had drawn from memory. They went through it step by step. At what point could the bridge failure have been caught? What the road preparation had actually indicated? What a trained scout's read of too clean should have meant in decision weight versus a vision's emotional urgency. What would need to exist? What structure? What verification requirement? What minimum number of independent checks to prevent the specific failure that had led to the bridge? It was not a theory. It was a scar becoming structure. The difference was important. Theory was what you built to avoid pain. Structure was what you built after it. The first test came when Nyra had a new vision, smaller than Stonewell, but specific. A storage room, dark ceiling with wet patches, a child coughing, a cracked basin, the smell of something organic going wrong. She wrote it down exactly as she had seen it. Then she called Riven, she said. Verify the storage rooms in the Lower Healers District. Don't take my word for it. Look. Riven found mold under the ceiling boards of the Eastern Supply House black rot that had spread from a broken drainage joint. He found 3 children in the surrounding area who had been coughing for 2 days. He found a cracked basin in the building's front room that had been used to store the herbs that were supposed to be treating them. Nyra took the physical record to a session where Senna and Leora were both present. Leora had not looked at Nyra directly since the bridge. She looked at the record. She said, "If the vision had been wrong, what would you have done?" Nyra said, "Then the evidence must be strong enough to stand without it." The decision that came out of that meeting: close the affected storage room, move the sick children to clean quarters, test the water source, and publish the reason for all of it so that anyone who wanted to verify or dispute the decision could do so. 3 days later, the small illness cluster was contained. No evacuation, no panic, no dead. Senna said afterward, quietly, "Not for the room, but for Nyra. The mark may warn you. But leadership begins when you let others question the warning." It was not a recovery. It was a method, and a method was something Varric could not dismiss as easily as a curse. Varric had been watching Nyra more carefully since she walked out of the council chamber. He had orchestrated Old Mill Hollow precisely. The bridge repair had taken 3 months of careful placement, 2 reliable workers, a series of inspections that found nothing wrong, the gapped wood construction hidden under tight surface planking. The messenger timing had required a contact in 2 waystation networks. The fire that had been meant to follow the evacuation had been his backup, the proof that the vision was right, the evidence that would have vindicated the decision even as the bridge was failing. He had not counted on Nyra publicly claiming the error before his narrative could claim it first. He had not counted on her walking into the council chamber and naming exactly what she had done wrong. He had seen people recover from public failure before, and the recovery usually looked like defense. Partial admissions, reframed narratives, loyal voices placed in the right rooms. What she was doing was different. She was building something structural out of the failure itself. The risk puzzle was a problem in a way that scandal was not. Scandal could be managed. A verifiable governance process that reduced her dependence on being trusted was a different category of threat. If she established a precedent where vision was checked against physical evidence, verified by multiple independent sources, and made publicly accountable, she would be making the case that Ashmoon Mark was a governance tool rather than a supernatural threat. He could not allow that. He began moving the pieces he had been preparing for months. He sent a letter to Riverhold Pack, unsigned but formatted in Ashfin's correspondence style, suggesting that Ashfin's unusual protections from the crown were connected to the mark-bearer's presence. He sent a letter to Ashfin formatted in Riverhold's style, suggesting that Riverhold's recent border disputes were being ignored because the king was distracted by his Omega. He arranged for a fire at a northern grain store and ensured that the witnesses who survived placed the source of the spark near the camp of Nyra's supporters. He had a messenger killed and the body arranged in a way that pointed toward Moonharrow Pack. He drafted the Emergency War Edict, a legal mechanism that transferred military command authority to the council in the event of simultaneous hostilities between 3 pack territories. All he needed was for the 3 packs to believe enough in the letters to posture at each other. But Nyra had a vision she did not understand at first. 3 flags burning, a river running the color of clay after heavy rain. Elias standing between 2 lines of soldiers, a council ring pressing a seal into dark wax. She wrote it down. She gave it to Riven. She said, "Find me the letters." Riven found the first one in a courier's bag that had been held at the Northern Way station longer than its contents required. He found the second in a border captain's archive, where it had been filed as suspicious enough to keep, but not suspicious enough to report up the chain. He brought both to Senna. Senna looked at the ink. She said, "This ink is only used in the council archive." Riven looked at the fold patterns. He said, "Ashfin does not fold correspondence this way." Nyra called the pack assembly. Not a closed session. Open. Every pack representative present. Every senior warrior. Every elder who wanted to attend. She did not open with the vision. She opened with the bridge at Old Mill Hollow. She said, "My mark showed me danger. My failure taught me danger can wear the face of certainty." The room was very quiet. She had chosen to say this first. Before the evidence, before Riven's report, before Leora's identification of the seal. She said she had been wrong before, and that the people in this room were entitled to remember that, and that she was not going to ask them to set it aside as the price of hearing what she was bringing. She said the evidence she was about to present would stand or fall on its own. It did not require them to trust her first. It required them to look. Then she presented the evidence in the sequence the risk table had built. Riven placed the letters on the table and described the ink provenance, the fold patterns, the courier route that ran through the council gate, rather than between the packs it claimed to connect. The grain store fire's witness accounts were read alongside a physical survey of the burn pattern that contradicted the testimony about spark origin. The dead messenger's arrangement, body positioned, not fallen, the specific way someone positions a body to tell a story rather than the way a body falls when a person dies. The Emergency War Edict, found in a sealed packet in Varick's personal archive, drafted and dated before any of the incidents it was designed to respond to had occurred. Leora had been sitting in the 3rd row. She had not planned to speak. But she had recognized something, an inversion in the way the Ashfin correspondence seal had been applied. A micro-detail she knew because she had been watching Ashfin elders seal letters her entire life. She stood, she said, "I lost my brother because we followed fear without questions. I will not lose a kingdom the same way." She pointed to the letter and described exactly what was wrong with the seal. It was the detail that closed the case, not dramatic, not loud, just specific and accurate in the way that things are accurate when someone has actually looked at them. Varick spoke. He said the documents could have been tampered with, he said. Nyra had already demonstrated her capacity for catastrophic misjudgment, he said. And Omega, with a mark that claimed to see danger, was precisely the kind of tool that enemies of the crown would use to manufacture crises. Nyra said yes. And that is why no one here will be asked to believe me without evidence again. The council guards moved on Varric before he reached the door. The emergency war edict never acquired the signatures it needed. The packs never sent their soldiers against each other. The Neutschien that Varric had spent months constructing collapsed in a room where all the doors were open. The days after Varric's arrest were not clean. Clean endings were for stories where nothing had actually been lost. These days had Leora still grieving her brother. They had pack territories that had been manipulated against each other, and now had to find their way back to something approximating trust. They had a council apparatus that had enabled Varric for years, and would need to be rebuilt rather than simply emptied. Some alphas proposed that Elias simply consolidate power in the meantime, appoint loyalists, move quickly, use the crisis as an opportunity to restructure. Elias said no. He said that what Velmora had just survived was not a crisis of wrong people in the right structure. It was a crisis of a structure that depended on no one asking questions. He said the solution was not to replace the wrong people with better ones. He said the solution was to build something that could survive the next Varric. The proposal that the pack representatives voted on was not his. When the alphas suggested that Elias formalize Nyra's position, Luna, Queen, whatever title would give her standing, Elias said, "If I name her Queen, they will say she rose because I lifted her. Let the packs decide whether she has stood." The vote happened on a day with no ceremony planned. The pack representatives came in, took their places, asked their questions. The questions were not easy. They asked about Old Mill Hollow. They asked about risk table decisions that had been wrong or inconclusive. They asked what would happen if Nyra's vision and the assembled evidence pointed in different directions. She answered all of it. When Leora stood to give Ashvin's vote, she said, "I do not vote for her because she never failed us. I vote for her because she stopped asking us to pretend failure was not real." The final alpha to vote was an elder from a mountain pack who had said nothing throughout the session. He had been at Ashvin the day Varric had read the Ashmoon Decree. He had not spoken against it. He had not spoken for it. He had simply been present. He placed his hand on the oath stone and said, "I vote for the woman who came back and counted the dead instead of explaining them away." The vote was not unanimous. It was enough. The Risk Crown Charter was her first act, not a declaration of power, a limitation of it. She wrote it herself, in the plain language of someone who had learned governance from the healer's end of disasters rather than the throne's. Vision could not be used as the sole basis for any emergency order. All crisis decisions were subject to risk table process when time permitted. Pack Assembly had formal standing to question any decree within 30 days. The council archive was open to auditors from any pack. The Ashmoon Decree was dissolved, not suspended, not under review, dissolved, with a formal acknowledgement that it had operated as an instrument of fear rather than law. The disaster response structure was placed under a council of healers, scouts, pack representatives, Omega Labor coordinators, and Royal Guard, with no single voice holding final authority. Queen and Alpha King held equal standing on the Crisis Council. In the case of disagreement, Pack Assembly resolved. Elias was the first to sign it. He had read it the night before and had come to Nyra with 2 questions about the pack assembly override provision. Both were legitimate. She had answered both. He had not asked to change it. He signed it below her name, in the position of second signatory, and there was nothing performative about the gesture. It was simply where he stood. He had been the person who stopped the system from killing her. He had not been the person who built what she had become. He understood the difference now in a way he had not understood it clearly when he first walked into the square at Ashfin. He had thought, then, that rescuing someone from a bad law was the end of the work. He understood now that it was barely the beginning. When the last seal was pressed, she said, "I was not saved so I could become another unquestioned voice. I was saved so I could learn to answer for mine." They were alone in the map room later that evening. She had been standing at the table for an hour, tracing the border territories where pack relations were still tense, thinking about the specific work of the next several months. He had come in quietly and had not interrupted her. When she finally looked up, he said, "I thought keeping distance protected you. I understand now that it sometimes only meant you carried things alone." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted you to choose me," she said, "not because of what it meant for you, because of what it would have meant for how safe I felt." He waited. "I don't need that anymore," she said, "not because I stopped wanting to be safe. Because I understand now that the safety I needed couldn't come from being chosen." He asked if there was room for something that was not rescue and not obligation. She looked at him the way she looked at evidence she was deciding whether to trust. "Yes," she said, "not because you saved me, not because the packs crowned me, because now I can choose without needing either to survive." A year later. The morning light in the risk table chamber was the kind that came through north-facing windows clear and without warmth, the kind that made everything easy to read. Nyra had a new vision. She wrote it down in the precise language she had developed. What she saw, the exact sequence, the sensory details, the elements she could not interpret. She gave the record to Riven. He left to verify the terrain indicators. Senna arrived to cross-check the healer observations. Leora came in, sat down across from Nyra, and said, "The part about the river, I want to understand the specific color you saw." She was still the kind of tired that did not resolve easily. But she was here. She was asking the hard question. Elias arrived last, looked at the table, said he had a question about the pack route that would need answering before any decision could be finalized, and sat down at the edge of the table where a vote could overturn him. In the training yard below the window, a group of young Omegas were practicing emergency response. Drills the kind that had been developed after Old Mill Hollow, the kind that taught how to move people safely rather than urgently. A small girl at the edge of the group had stopped to look at her wrist. There was something there, a mark. She looked up. Nyra was at the window. Their eyes met. Nyra came down to the yard. She crouched in front of the girl and looked at the mark, silver-threaded, familiar in its shape. The girl said, "Is it bad?" Nyra said, "A mark is not a sentence. It is a question. And questions deserve teachers, not executioners." The girl looked at her. She looked at the table in the window above, where the people with the maps and the records and the voices that could say, "I am not certain yet," were still working. Nyra became queen not because the Alpha King chose her. She became queen because, after the world called her a curse, she taught it how to survive what it refused to understand.